Welcome to another Watercolours with Caroline. This week I would like to do a simple stormy sky for beginners, just to sort of explain how you can layer in different colours and mix a nice stormy grey. And this is based on a photograph that I took on the west coast of Vancouver Island. We have a few beautiful beaches there, Long Beach, Mackenzie Beach and different ones, and the weather can go from gorgeous and sunny to foggy and rainy in seconds, and that happened this day that I was photographing. We had a lovely sunny, I think July day, and all of a sudden the mist rolled in and the dark clouds, and I loved the effect. So let's get your paints ready and your paper and let's get started. So I'm just going to do a little painting for 4 inches by 6 inches for a demo, and I suggest if you're a beginner you do little paintings too, just so that you can do a lot of paintings and you can use really good quality paper. I usually always use 140-pound Arches cold pressed, and I love painting on it. Sometimes if you're a beginner and you've been using student paint, it's difficult to switch to a good quality paint. You maybe don't like it at first because you're just not used to how it works, but once you get used to it, I swear you'll love a good at least 100% cotton paint. Now I've done my little sketch based on a painting that I did a long time ago, based on a photo of Tonquin Beach in Tofino, BC. And if you're doing a big sky, you need to keep your horizon low, so about 1/3. For this one, if your metric is about 3 centimeters up, if your imperial it's about 1.25 inches up, and keep your horizon line nice and straight. And if you have rocks or something, don't put your line through that, or if you do, erase it, because your pencil lines will show through a lot of your paint and you can't erase them once you get the paint on there. Now if you're doing a sky, you need to usually work wet in wet, because the sky is big and it's soft and billowy and you can't usually get a good look. I'm going to zoom in. I have to remember where my zoom button is. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit so you can see better. So I'm going to wet my whole sky, and that means dipping into your water often. If you're a beginner, what beginners tend to do is dip their brush once and keep trying to wet with that one brush full of water. It's not going to happen. You have to dip every few brush strokes and get that paper nice and wet. It's summer right now, it's July, so it's quite warm, it's quite dry, and some of you are having a heat wave, so it'll be even warmer, so you have to get extra wet if that's the case, because your sky is not going to work if it's too dry. You can tell it's wet because the paper will be nice and shiny. You don't want your water like dripping off the paper, but you do want it wet. Now this is where the student quality papers fall down. They don't allow you to wet this much. They don't soak up the water, it kind of floats on the top and you don't get a good effect. I'm going to start with Cerulean Blue. Now I've got my blues over here. My palette's still got a little bit of Cerulean Blue in it, so I'm going to pop a bit more in here. If my paper's already wet, I don't want my paint too wet. If you put really wet paint on really wet paper, it's just all going to dissolve. So you have to think about that if you're a beginner painter, that not so much water with your paint. And I just want a little bit, there's going to be a little bit of blue sky showing here before the storm clouds come in. Maybe that, I'm just going to turn that light off, it's a bit too shiny. There we go. So I just want to put that little bit of Cerulean Blue in the center there, and see how I've left white for the clouds. Now I want to put near the horizon, the sky, because it was getting stormy, went kind of a beigey color, and this is raw sienna. I like raw sienna because it's more transparent than yellow ochre, which is a very similar color but a little bit more opaque. So let's get some raw sienna, and I'm going to put that just down near the horizon. This is layer 1 of this painting, and I can actually put that along those rocks because those rocks are going to have some raw sienna in. Put that down here. Now with that raw sienna, I'm going to mix a nice cool rosy color. Now if you don't have permanent rose, which is what I like to use, you can use alizarin crimson. Both are a cool rosy color. I'm just going to take a little touch, it's a very, very small touch of permanent rose, and add it to that raw sienna. I've lost my raw sienna. There we go. I'm going to mix a little bit more. It just pinks it up and warms it up a little bit. And I'm going to add a little bit of that. This is all going to be underneath our storm sky. I'm going to add a little bit of that rosy color. Now, look at how light that is. Skies are really light, even these stormy skies. And you especially want the contrast of the stormy sky with this light clouds and sky underneath. Now while that's soaking in, I need it to soak in and I need it to dry before I go on. I can do the sand down here. I can use that same mix that I just made. I'm going to add a bit more. This is dry down here. Didn't wet it. I'm going to add a little bit more water to that mix. Bring it over, and a little bit more raw sienna. The water will make it lighter. And where all the rocks are going to be here, and the sand, this is just like a first layer, and it doesn't matter if they bleed into the sky because that's all going to get dried before the next layer. And I can just put an underlayer of sand and rock color here. Now you can use just raw sienna. I just added that touch of rose to warm it up a little bit and make it slightly orange so that it sort of complements all the blues that are going to be in this picture. And now I'm going to have to dry that. So I'm going to leave you for a minute while I dry this. Now I used a hairdryer to speed up the drying process, and it needs to be perfectly dry. To test it with the back of your finger because it's more sensitive to cold and warm and dry, and it should feel perfectly dry and not cold on the back of your finger. Also, you have less oil. You have a lot of oil on your fingers that you don't really know about, but it's there, and that will make big oily marks on your painting. If you're a beginner, it's so important to let your layers dry perfectly. Ideally, you should just go away and let it soak in a bit before you dry it, but I speeded the whole process up because second layer of the sky, the storm clouds, I'm going to wet all over again. And because this first layer is perfectly dry, and because I have good quality cotton paper, cold press, which grabs the paint, it won't lift as I wet the second layer. If you have cheap paper, if you don't dry it properly, it will lift. It will all come off when you do the second layer. So if you're having that problem, it's either because your paper's too cheap or it's not properly dry. But you can see I can go back and forth with my brush and water, and I will not lift that first layer. It's perfectly fine. Now, storm clouds. My favorite gray is Ultramarine Blue with burnt sienna. I love this grey. Of course, you can use Payne's grey if you want. You can use ultramarine with burnt umber. You can mix a different grey if you like. It's just that ultramarine with burnt sienna is my favourite grey. If you add too much burnt sienna, I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to add too much. You'll get brown. You don't want brown. You want grey. So I'm going to go back and add some more ultramarine to turn it grey. Now ultramarine and burnt sienna with a touch of alizarin crimson is almost exactly like Payne's grey. Payne's grey is just a mix. The manufacturers use slightly different pigments for their own brand of mix. What I want you to notice is how little water I have with this colour. I haven't added much water because I want it dark and I want it dramatic in my sky. I can add, if I want, a little bit of alizarin crimson to warm it up and purple it up a little bit. That's also makes a good grey. Now, for my storm clouds that were coming in on that sunny day, I want to sweep them sweep them in over top of that sky. It'll be really scary. You'll be like, oh, I don't want to do this. It's too dark. But it's going to dry so much lighter. And you can vary your mix. You can add a little bit more alizarin crimson if you wanted a bit warmer. The clouds are big at the top, at the zenith of the sky, and as they come down the sky, they get thinner and narrow. And I want to leave that white space near the dark sea. Don't just come across horizontally. Kind of have a bit of a diagonal sweep. You know, big at the corner, coming down little, and you need to see this cerulean blue and the summer sky behind these clouds. Because I have the water on there, it's going to dilute the paint out and let it flow around really nicely. And here's the mistake that most beginners make. They just keep going on adding more and more paint. They don't stop until this whole sky is covered in grey clouds and you can't see anything underneath. The key to painting is to just do a little bit and then stop. If you find that it's not enough, when it's dry, you can wet the sky again and add a little bit more. There's no problem with doing that, but putting too much on and you'll be trying to wash it all off, and then you'll be really sad with your sky. I'm going to add just a little bit more here. I added a little bit of alizarin crimson to that, but I need the water now to do the work. And so many beginners don't let the water do the work. They make their brush do the work, and it just keeps on getting worse and worse. So think about that as you're painting. You'll notice that because I've used a good Daniel Smith Ultramarine Blue, it's granulating well. I don't know if you can see that. I'll try and zoom in a little bit more. But it's really granulating well in the sky. And especially if you mix it with burnt sienna, you get a really good granulation. So I'm very happy with what's happening, and I don't want to touch it. Don't touch it with water. Don't touch it with your brush. Leave it alone. And I promise you, if you just go away and make a cup of tea and then come back, it will look beautiful when you come back. I'm going to do that. Now, I let the paint soak in for a long time before I finished it off with a hairdryer, so it had time to really granulate and spread in the water. And I also did my interpretation of some of the mistakes that I see beginners make. I've been teaching for 27 years, and I know the struggles that beginners have with watercolour. One of the big mistakes is not wetting the paper correctly. So you see a big dry patch here and here and here and here where the paper wasn't wet enough to put the wash on. Under here, careless wetting of the paper, so it's gone down below the horizon line, so you get a water stain as the paint goes into the careless wetted area. Using too much brown in the grey mix, and the brown really shows through as the paint separates and dries. And not, if you're going to tape the edge, you need to paint right over the tape and not come just sort of short at the edge here. Otherwise you get these really odd shapes at the edge of the page. So these are all beginner mistakes. Plus they keep going, and they add water to try and make up for the mistakes, which makes big water blooms like here. And they're very sad because it all ends up looking a bit of a mess. The only thing you can do is keep trying. You just need to keep trying till you find how it works for you. And lots of little paintings, at least that way you're not feeling you're wasting paper. So now the sky is finished. We're not going to do any more to it. I don't want it to be too dramatic. You could put a third layer if you wanted it more dramatic, but it has to be perfectly dry, and you have to re-wet the whole thing again. I want to just put the ocean in. For that, I'm going to use Ultramarine Blue, and I don't want the ocean to be too dark everywhere. I do in places, but not everywhere, and I'm going to use a little bit, that's too much, a little bit of raw sienna just to make the ocean a tiny bit greener. I'm just sort of going back and forth between my ultramarine and my raw sienna. Still want it to be blue. Add a bit more water to lighten it. A bit more blue. And I'm going to get working with my number 8. I love my number 8 brush. I'm splashing water everywhere. Now everything's perfectly dry, and I'm working on dry paper. And I'm getting that watercolour I just mixed up for the ocean, and I'm going to put the ocean in, going with horizontal brush strokes, keeping that horizon lovely and straight. If you have trouble with a shaky hand, put a piece of masking tape there. And if you want some light reflecting on the waves, if you're very careful as you paint, you can leave some dry paper with some little white strips of light reflecting from the parts of the sky that aren't cloudy yet, just reflecting off the ocean. As I come closer to the shore, I'm going to get a smaller brush, a little bit more water, and come close to the shoreline here. Lighter and lighter as I get closer to the shoreline. So some of the ocean is still reflecting the lovely bright daylight that we had and sunshine. Some of it's going to be reflecting the dark clouds. So I'm taking a little bit of that cloud mix that I still have here, a little bit more ultramarine blue to it, and a small brush. This is a number 2 brush. You can use number 2 or number 1. And just along the horizon line, this is still wet where I put the paint on, very gently I'm adding a little bit of dark. This is the reflection from these cloudy storm clouds that are coming in, but I don't want it everywhere. I don't want to make my sea too dark because water is reflecting light and the sky is very light even with clouds, so you don't want to go too dark with everything. What I want is a contrast. I want some nice dark rocks in contrast to that that light sky and lighter ocean. I know it's the darkest part of the painting right now, but it won't be once I get some of these rocks on there. My sky is perfectly dry, so I can put in some of my background trees. In the mist, the ones in the distance were very, very misty, and as you got closer, the trees stood out more. So I want to make very, very misty colour for those trees in the background. So I've got my ultramarine blue here that I used for ocean, and I'm going to add a little bit more raw sienna and a little bit of burnt sienna and a little bit of rose, permanent rose or alizarin crimson. I'm going to go back and forth till I get a sort of a misty purpley grey colour, just for the distant trees. And I'm going to add water because they're way off in the distance, and I'm going to put those in because my sky is dry and I have my little tiny number 2 brush. You can use a 2 or a 1, and I don't bother drawing the trees because I don't want any pencil marks showing. I just want these misty trees in the distance, and I'm adding more and more water because I want them in the mist, and I can add water as I go along so that there's just, I got nice clean water too while I was waiting for my paint to soak in. So back here the water just makes a kind of a grey mist as I come down like this, and I can put that water on for the mist, get a little bit of that grey purple mix that I made, and I can just have some trees coming out of that mist just by popping them in there. And here. So I started with the trees, and then I put water, just clean water for a bit of mist, but that grey will come down into that clean water and dirty it up, make it misty. Now I am going to get greener with the next layer of trees, don't worry. I just want these ones off in the distance before I do that. And also make sure that you're just going really slowly at this point. You're on dry paper and a tiny brush, so you don't need to rush. You don't have any deadlines. I've got water on my sky here. So just take your time. I can add, to make that a little bit greener, I can use the ultramarine blue again, and I'm going to use a little bit of, I use M. Graham's Azo Yellow, but you can use cadmium yellow. I just have found that for me, I love the brightness and transparency of the Azo Yellow. So I've just made my mix a little greener for the trees as they're coming closer. And you can practice these trees on a piece of scrap paper before you do them. I know I'm just kind of going for it, but I've been painting trees in British Columbia for the past 35 years or so, and I've just have some muscle memory for doing that. That's all it is. And the more you paint something, the more you look at something, the more muscle memory you'll have for that thing that you're painting, whatever it be. Oh, I'm adding a little bit more ultramarine blue and yellow to that grey mix, because as the trees come closer, they're going to get bigger and they're going to get greener. I suggest, if you want to paint these kinds of fir trees that we have here in British Columbia, especially on Vancouver Island, we have mostly Douglas firs, a lot of them. Just find a picture of them and practice and practice and practice on some pieces of scrap paper. It's the only way you can get better, is to just keep doing something until you develop that muscle memory. There is no other way. It's time and practice. So pop those trees in. Now my shoreline is really dry too, so I can pop these rocks in. I'm using a very limited palette for this painting, and again I'm going back to my Ultramarine Blue. Use a bigger brush, Caroline. Mix with bigger brushes, don't distress your little brushes, they'll wear out quickly. So this time I'm using more brown in the mix because I want the rocks to be more brown and darker and on dry paper. So first of all, I'm going to put these rocks in here. The beaches around this area are scattered, absolutely scattered with rocks everywhere. And they're quite jagged, a lot of them. And the reason I'm putting these over here, even though they are scattered all over the beach, but compositionally, I have a lot going on over on the left-hand side. I have all these dark trees. I'm going to have some dark rocks. And if I don't balance it with something dark over on the right side here, it's all going to be too heavy on one side and completely unbalanced. So you don't need much to balance your painting up again. You need something that's just as dark on the other side of the painting so that you can pull the eye back. Now, I'm not filling in the whole rock, and what you can do is you can use a thirsty brush. That means you wash your brush, you dry it on a Kleenex or a towel, and then you can lift off a little bit of the top of the rock just to give a highlight. I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to the mix. I want it a bit more brown, a bit warmer. And then I'm going to do the rocks over here. I don't want them to bleed into the trees, so I need to be really careful that the trees are almost dry before I do the rocks. I'll start down here so that I'm not going to bleed into those trees. And again, I don't want to fill up the whole rock with the colour. I want some highlights. And I'm being very quick and loose, just because I want this to be a quick video, a beginner video. If you want a more detailed painting, you can definitely take more time to put in more detail. Now I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush. I want to plug in a bit more of this detail a bit more quickly. And I also want to make sure that I have some highlights on these rocks so that they're not just solid brown. Also, as the rocks are sitting on the sand, if you don't have a nice horizontal flat bottom to them, they don't look like they're sitting on anything. They have to have a base to them. They have to sit down on the ground. And we're going to do something in just a minute to make them do that a bit more. Now, I'm simplifying these rocks a great deal, but I'm going to use my thirsty brush again. I'm getting my smaller brush. I'm washing it, drying it, and then I'm just going to suck out a few highlights. And again, if you're a beginner, don't go sucking out all the paint. That's a real temptation, is once you learn that technique, all you do is keep going along and sucking out more and more paint until your rocks have disappeared. They will dry a little bit lighter. I put a little bit more blue in my mix. I'm just adding a little bit more depth to the underside of those rocks, and these ones too. You can add a little bit of debris to the beach. It always looks nice. There's always kind of debris on the beach. Just a few dots here and there. And over in the distance, way back there, there were some rocks, but I'm going to use raw sienna for that. They're further away. And I'm going to add a little bit of the sea colour. Well, I don't want to add too much sea colour because then they will blend into the sea. And I'm going to just put those over here. They were in the distance. A little bit of my dark colour and just drop it in a little bit to those rocks back there. I just don't want them as distinct as the foreground rocks. Now we're almost done. We're almost finished this painting. I don't want to fuss with the ocean too much. There's plenty of things I could do if I wanted a more detailed painting, but I just want this quick and mainly to show you how to do the stormy sky. The very last thing I would do when these rocks are dry, and I will dry them to make sure they're dry, is put a little bit of reflection in the wet sand. So I've dried off my rocks, and I have here my rock colour, the Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna. I'm going to add a little bit more Ultramarine Blue to that, and some Permanent Rose, or you can add alizarin crimson and make it sort of purpley colour, violetty colour. And add some water. And what I want to do is just put some reflections in the wet sand. So I'm going to come from the rock here. I'm just going to like pull down like this with a bigger brush. And maybe here. And I'm going to get my teeny tiny brush in that same colour. And right along where the waves come against the shore, they always make a shadow, and it makes the sand darker right under those waves. I'm just going to put a shadow in where those waves come in. And if you feel I'm feeling my shadows a little bit too sharp, I'm going to just get my wet brush and just soften that up a bit. Just a sort of wet in wet technique. I might get some backgrounds and blooms that I don't mind. Right now I'm working on making this look like a watercolour. Also I'm going to get a little bit of that dark colour that I just used and add a bit more Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna. And maybe just add a few more shadows on these rocks. Deepen them up a little bit. And maybe these ones. You don't want to add too much. Again, less is always more. Just wait until it's dry and see what you think. See if you need a little bit more. And it's much easier to put a few little details on dry paper than trying to work on damp paper or wet paper. And that's pretty much done. It's just a quick little study. Not really what we'd call a finished painting when you do this. It's called a study. It's to help you learn things and practice. And a finished painting takes me 3 or 4 days. I work on it for about 6 hours a day. And of course they're bigger than this. I typically work on a 11 by 14 or a 9 by 12, something like that. And it will take me days. And I will go several layers. But for a little study, for learning something, this is what you do. So I hope yours turns out well. If you want to ask me any questions in the comments box, please do. I'll always answer them. Take care. I'll talk again soon. Thank you for watching and joining in. How did your painting go? If you want to show me your painting, why don't you go onto Facebook and look for Watercolours with Caroline. I have a group there where you can post your paintings, ask questions, make comments if they're kind. And you can make comments in the YouTube video if you like, and I will answer them, especially if you have questions. So thanks again. We'll see you soon.